you are born once, but to be reborn again means to be reborn with a knowledge, with a new reflection on what that initial unconscious sense of being born meant. So it's a recommitment in many ways. And I think that's something that is so fundamental in everyone's life, that it is really the symbolic theme of humanity.
Being a kind of dreamy-eyed optimist doesn't get a lot of things done. But I would say he's both positive and pretty realistic about how the world works. And maybe that comes from his background, which is at one time, of course, was a very tragic beginning after the Holocaust. But primarily, he's a person who wakes up every day and thinks about how wonderful it is to be an American, how wonderful it is to be alive. Yeah, it's a very uplifting experience.
Just look at this library. It has such a broad set of experiences that he brings to this office, and keeps us all fresh and keeps us all young. And I mean that in a very sincere way, that I think he has the most youthful spirit in office.
He's listening to something beyond just the kind of the basics of architecture, right? I mean, he's obviously very talented visually, right, and composition, and I would even call him kind of an old-fashioned architect in a way, right, because he cares about balance, composition, light, how it sits in an urban setting, context, and his language is one that I think is about discovery.
I don't really know why I use the language. It's like why I like gray more than purple. It's not an intellectual thing. I cannot really answer it, but I know there's something in me that rebels against a certain kind of geometry. I have a certain feeling that I can't draw a certain angle. And maybe Leonardo da Vinci was right, that the acute angle is the angle of strength. It interests me. It seems to be what the world is about.
You're doing something positive per se in the work you're doing, because you're doing something for the people. As an architect, I mean, you're always in the role of creating something forward-looking.
A project is never about itself. It's what it does to the world. It can be a very small and humble place, but it can have a tremendous strength in inspiring people. And what is more important than inspiring a single child with an idea? Nothing can be more important. No military force can compare with a child's wide-eyed view of the world.
When we came to Berlin, it was very difficult emotionally to make that decision. But it was actually a decision we made in a moment. And it is a road that you come to. And it's not just, do you want to be an architect or you don't? It is, do you want this building to get built? And because it was a building that dealt with a very specific and a very meaningful content, it was a project worth fighting for.
Everybody expected some modest addition to the old building. Daniel came up with this dramatic zigzagging structure that people were totally surprised by. And over the years, I think the role changes and people value it and they understand, what it really does. Not only as a piece of architecture, but also in its surrounding, in the neighborhood where it stands and the spaces that it creates around it.
Just the surface of the Berlin Museum, just the fenestration, the materiality, the uniqueness of its patterns, immediately kind of engages the observer that there's something unique about this face that's been projected onto this building. There's something that is out of the ordinary. And then when you begin to associate the visual impact with its content, it allows you not to just sort of make a pinpoint relationship between its content and the artifact. It allows you to actually project yourself and project your own meaning and your own associations.
And that was a very deliberate move on Daniel's part. So the first moment that you're there, you're in the old Baroque building, and suddenly see that this old Baroque building also had a very shocking insertion into it, and that was the staircase that goes all the way down. And again, it was the idea that one had to go through the underground history of Berlin in order to experience what was emerging as the sensibility of Jewish German life above ground. And that underground was very simply 3 roads. The most dramatic, for sure, is the road that leads to the Holocaust Tower, and that road is quite steeply inclined, so by the time you reach the Holocaust Tower, both the ceiling and the road seem to shrink, and it's a compression of space. And what always interested me is that when people would come into that space and the door would close behind, without any prescription by anyone saying you have to be quiet now, they would fall into silence. You were separated and divorced from that experience of being a normal person in Berlin. It was a very real physical experience. How cold it is in the winter, what the light means when it comes through that window, what it means when the door closes behind you, how warm it can get in the summer. These are not experiences that people normally have in a museum, and I think it was an important way of integrating those very physical experiences and very visceral experiences into the museum experience. And then you exit that space and you go into the garden, which are these 49 pillars, 7 by 7, where the earth is contained within the pillar and the vegetation is at the top. It is a ground which is both tilted in 2 different angles, so when you're there, you can get pretty disoriented and you can feel what it's like to be an immigrant or on a ship where nothing seems terribly stable. The third pathway is this very quite steep staircase which takes you up to the top of the building, and as you walk up the stair you see through the window, of course, the entire lay of the land. You see the Holocaust Tower and you see the Garden of Exile, and then you start walking through the actual exhibits on the 3rd floor. And the exhibits themselves are housed in a building which have these gashes, these windows.
It's a disruption, it's a reorientation, it's a permanent waking up in a new Berlin, and remembering that you're not alone, that there are ghosts and shadows that are fully alive around you. Many, many aspects. So I never considered it just a building that responds to a particular program, but a building that has to create that program through the experience of the visitors, who will have been born in a luckier time. You know, everybody remembers what they did on September 11th. And I remember it very well because it was that morning, September 11th, 2001, when the Jewish Museum opened its doors to the public after 13 years of being in construction and discussion. You know, I won the competition in 1989. Finally, that was the day, September 11th, 2001, the doors opened to the museum, 10 o'clock in the morning, Berlin time. And I went to the studio that morning and I said, you know, I feel totally liberated. It's the first day I don't really have to think about history, Jewish history, because people can now enter the museum. They can make their own judgments. And then, of course, by about 2:30 in the afternoon, Berlin time, it was 8:40 here in New York, we saw those images on the screen. And I suddenly realized that's not a viable statement. History is always going on. There's never such a moment as now I don't have to think about it, because everything is in a strange way interconnected. And certainly at that very moment, I turned to everyone, Carla, Nina, and I said, I want to return to Lower Manhattan. I'm coming back to New York.
What Daniel was most interested in was how to really weave this site also back into the city. So reintroducing the street grid, because the original World Trade Center was kind of an island. So distinguishing the memorial on that 8 acres and then allowing the street grid to come through really makes it more part of New York than the site was previously.
So it's really about a conception of the city, an open, incredibly fantastic city with a cultural sense.
And Daniel had the idea of the towers really creating a spiral, right? They aren't exactly on the New York City grid, so they stand out. And from far away in the skyline was to create a composition, which is, inspired by the Statue of Liberty, that cradles that memorial that's on the ground plane.
One of the most important things that we implemented in the master plan were the footprints of the towers. That experience is about walking around those enormous footprints with 3,000 plus names imprinted into those footprints, seeing how deep those buildings 70 feet below ground were inlaid, and seeing how people look into those waterfalls and think to themselves, my God, these buildings fell with such a resounding clap. And that water falls into those light holes with such a beautiful sound. How incredible and how amazing the sound of that water is compared to the incredible sound of those buildings collapsing.
We saw something we should have never seen, which is the foundations that were revealed, that Slurry Wall, which is that huge dam that holds the waters of the Hudson from flooding all of the underground of New York.
It's an incredibly moving experience because this was a wall which does stand for resilience, and it was a wall that did withstand the attack. Very few other things withstood that attack.
Ultimately, for me, the most successful sort of measure of Ground Zero will be how people will go there without necessarily thinking about it as Ground Zero, but because it's an interesting place in New York City. People will remember it because they like the space, and that's ultimately the most sustainable architecture and the most sustainable urbanism, is to make a place that is memorable.
I'm lucky because I was one of the last immigrants in 1959 to come to New York on a boat, with other immigrants, and that's sort of an iconic, because most people now fly, the immigrants fly, to Kennedy or wherever, but coming on the boat and being woken up early by my mother, at 5 o'clock in the morning, with my sister saying, "Go up, you're gonna see New York," and of course you after the voyage you sort of long to see something, and then you see, just like in the movies, really, it's not an exaggeration, the Statue of Liberty coming out of the mists, and that skyline of New York, which there's nothing for an 11-year-old that could even sort of fathom that skyline from pictures or from movies. It's an unbelievable. It's as if you landed on Mars. You cannot believe the heights of buildings. You cannot believe the incredible, extraordinary beauty of Manhattan, and of course that. And arriving on Hudson River and being an immigrant coming out of the boat without the language, not speaking a word of English, that is a fundamental experience of my life. And of course, when I was designing the Ground Zero, the idea of what to do, I thought that it should really tell that story.
I think Daniel was convinced that we would be disqualified, but he didn't really care. He wanted to make a contribution to the conversation, or to, give his best idea. And then you forget that the generals and the military leaders that were part of the jury are really brave guys. They fly planes into fire. So they weren't afraid of a strong idea. They were quite inspired by it.
That's right, we could have lost the competition. In some cases, you have to take that risk to just do what you feel is the right move. So then we'd rather pull out of the competition here than do something meaningful.
You have to have a different look at it. And often, of course, that leads you into trouble. And I've been in trouble a lot of times because of that. But so what? You have to do something. Life isn't about just shaking your head and falling asleep. It's often going against the common story. It's often going against the grain.
So Daniel's idea was to say the first thing that one has to do is to take this very homogeneous facade of the armory and to break it. And to break it in a way which would make very clear to the observer from the outside that something else was going on the inside.
And that cut appears on the facade just exactly between World War I and World War II. So it frames, it's kind of asymmetrical. It disrupts that chronology, which is horizontal in the museum, and suddenly a vertical, oblique space with light coming down in a dramatic way is completely different. It's really about people. It's not about hardware. It's not about military strategy. It's not about weapons. It's about human beings. And it's really that moment of reflection. Where am I?
And oddly enough, people have begun to see this part of the museum as a museum that brings a topic about peace. And it's not about pacifism, it's about peace. So the emotional impact that you have is that you're walking from what is a very beautifully installed but conventional continuity of history of the military, and you are suddenly in spaces which are dramatically different, which are vertical and not horizontal. And when you cross into those spaces of the new insertion, this new wedge, this new part of the museum. You are no longer talking about the story of the military. You're talking about what it means, why it happens, who's impacted, what kind of mentality follows Hitler, what kind of impact does it have on cities, what kind of impact do instruments of war have on humanity, what kind of impact does it have on children, what kind of impact does it have on families, why is there war?
Memory is the mother of the muses, and of course that's what art of architecture is about. It appeals to the human soul, to the heart, and unless a building moves your heart, and that's what a museum is. A museum is not a place just to hang exhibits and take people around with information. It's a place of consciousness. It's to rekindle, to revitalize a consciousness that might be sort of asleep, and to suddenly ring the bell and the echoes of that bell, and to leave something after the visit. You know, the buildings that I love are not the buildings that I see on the covers of the magazine, but buildings that have left a mark. You know, it's a strange feeling, and that strangeness, like the strangeness of Hamlet, like the strangeness of the smile of the Mona Lisa, like the strangeness of the violence depicted on the pediment of the Parthenon, that's the strangeness of the encounter of oneself with history and its future. That's really the sense of wonder in architecture, that after destruction, after loss, after void, you can re-enter the place through that void, through the destruction, through that memory, and yet see a horizon that is full of possibility, of hope. I think that is truly rebirth. It's not only a word, it's an experience that goes beyond just the visual or the mental. It's really the human movement towards the light.